I'm Bridget Rivera, and this is the depiction of law enforcement in the media, analyzing the thin line between pop culture and propaganda. When I was a little kid, my parents were both at work during the day, and we would watch TV together at night. Probably TV shows I shouldn't have watched because I was way too young, but I did anyway because they let me. Like most Americans, they watched the regular police procedural, and I grew up watching it with them. It was because of these depictions that when I grew up in America that was divided racially and socially, I knew there were bad cops. But I thought it was only a very small margin because that's what pop culture had taught me. I saw police violence happening in the news, but I figured they were isolated incidents. I knew that people of color are more likely to be victimized by the police, but it never actually clicked for me that it was happening irregularly in modern day America. The representation of American law enforcement has evolved with film and television, as well as with the American political landscape. While law enforcement was often portrayed as comedic relief in the earlier part of the 1900s, it has evolved as time has passed to become more dramatic and heroic. The one-year constant that has remained is the idea that the police force exists mostly as a force of good and peace. Law enforcement is often portrayed as the good guys of the narrative, especially in media that centers around officers and protagonist roles. While media about law enforcement can span into different genres, including drama, thriller, or even comedy, there are behaviors consistently represented in these shows that are framed as right and sympathetic, even if it goes directly against police procedure. While there are examples of corrupt police in television in shows like The Shield, The Wire, and Unbelievable, they are framed as mature and dark and are not seen as the mainstream. It wasn't until about 6 months ago when I had the metaphorical ice bucket poured over my head when one of my professors talked about their experience as a peace officer. It was an eye-opening experience, to say the least. She talked about how the questions the police are taught to use are often meant to make the person incriminate themselves. She told us how they were encouraged to use force. She talked about how these ideals they were taught in the 6 months of training that they had is what determined how they policed for the rest of their law enforcement career. It revealed to me that the issue was much more systematic than I had ever realized, and it made me look at why it had never really clicked for me before. Recent events have made it important to analyze how law enforcement is depicted in popular culture and how that has influenced our ideas on them. The deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd have led to protests across the United States and the rest of the world calling for police reform and defunding, specifically as a response to police brutality and racial discrimination. While we may think of these depictions as fictional, they still have the ability to affect our opinion and ideas about law enforcement. With this in mind, it is essential to examine the tropes and stereotypes present in the media concerning law enforcement and how it can help to shape and form our opinions. The best way to show how these shows influence our opinion on law enforcement is by looking at the common tropes associated with them. The encompassing idea in a lot of police shows is that the police are morally right in doing everything in their personal power to solve a case. One of the first tropes that we see is that obtaining a warrant is only an obstacle to catching a criminal. Often, a law enforcement officer will know they are close to catching a criminal, and it is depicted as being obvious to the audience. But law enforcement are unable to actually follow through on their suspicions unless they have a warrant. In television, it is often depicted that by the time they will have gotten a warrant from a judge, the suspect will have already gotten rid of evidence that proves they committed the crime or will have escaped to never face charges. This often leads to law enforcement finding a way around the rule however they can, and it being depicted as a positive thing to the audience, despite it presenting the Fourth Amendment as obstructive. The next trope we see is the demonization of lawyers. The depiction of lawyers in pop culture is a genre in itself, but for the purposes of this presentation, we will look at lawyers specifically as seen in shows revolving around law enforcement. The Sixth Amendment is a right to a lawyer in case of being arrested for a crime. When under trial for anything, one of the first things that is recommended to us is to have a lawyer present. But in shows about law enforcement, asking for a lawyer is a sign of being suspicious or guilty. Obtaining a lawyer is seen as another obstacle for the police, stopping them from asking the questions they need to solve the case. Lawyers are not presented as helping to prove their client is innocent, but stopping their client from being found guilty. Two ideas that sound like they should be the same, but are in truth incredibly different. A lawyer needs to be absent to have the most productive interrogation scenes. Law enforcement, as depicted in TV shows, represent interrogations as the final nail in the coffin for proving a suspect is guilty. The scenes often allow the law enforcement officer to resort to any means they need to in order to bring justice to the victims, no matter how aggressive their actions are. The confessions they get from these are never depicted as being false statements, despite any coercion that seems to be present in the scenes. In reality, coercion and pressure during interrogations often leads to false statements where innocent people are arrested, tried, and sentenced for crimes they didn't commit. The most prevalent and troublesome trope of them all is the doesn't go by the book cop. While they may tolerate some of the tropes previously mentioned, they are willing to break the rules in order to get results. They may be reprimanded for their actions, but the results they obtain stop them from being put on administrative leave or being fired. The most problematic element of this trope is that they are being depicted as an anti-hero, for this person is willing to do anything to bring justice to victims. In reality, a cop who does not follow procedure is breaking the law and often hurts countless innocent citizens who are in their path. When looked at individually, it's obvious how problematic these elements are and how they should never be happening in real life, but television has changed our perspective of them. The one constant in scripted media about law enforcement is the characters. These characters make the tropes that we've looked at justifiable, and we sympathize with them as a result. While we are able to be objective when looking at these incidents when they are in real life, when we see the characters we have grown attached to and understand their points so immensely, their actions suddenly become okay. You may not like the New York Police Department and see their individual actions like stop and frisk as problematic and hurtful to people of color. But if you watch Law and Order SVU, you probably like Captain Olivia Benson. I am not saying that it is bad to see these characters as humans and that we shouldn't work to understand their position, but we as people are all capable of problematic behavior. By not presenting an opposing side to law enforcement and media, or only presenting the other side as extreme, it glorifies law enforcement by dehumanizing others. It can be seen how widespread these depictions of these characters and the justification of their actions are when we see how often law enforcement is presented this way. If we just looked at the Law and Order franchise, there's Law and Order SVU, Law and Order Criminal Intent, Law and Order Trial by Jury, and Law and Order LA. Or we could look at the CSI franchise, of which there is CSI Crime Scene Investigation, CSI Miami, CSI New York, and CSI Cyber. Or maybe you want a different show. If you have a streaming service, you can watch Hawaii Five-0, iZombie, Criminal Minds, JAG, NCIS, NCIS Los Angeles, NCIS New Orleans, Blue Bloods, Chicago PD, The Following, Psych, Elementary, 24, The Mentalist, and so on. All of these illustrate law enforcement as almost entirely heroic without depicting the unjust side that is becoming more and more obvious to the everyday American. There are some who argue that the police drama is simply a result of easy formatting. It's very easy for there to be a whole set of new characters, new situations, and new drama that we can tune into every week, even if we missed last week's episode. The issue with this argument is that it distracts from the true point. It is not important how we got here, but instead it is important where we are. By being aware of these elements that are being presented to us and looking at the facts surrounding law enforcement, we are able to prevent our biases from affecting how we view real-life issues. TV shows and films about law enforcement are popular and probably will stay popular for a fairly long time, but we as consumers don't have to be molded by it. By being aware, we are part of the solution and lead to a better, more informed future. I don't watch police shows with my family that much anymore. We're more likely to watch the Food Network now, but when a show about law enforcement comes on, I know better now. Thank you.